Hello, friends, and welcome to your Daily Detroit. It's Monday, August 12th, 2024. I am Jer Stays, and back on the other end of the line, Steve Freese. Little behind the scenes. We usually talk on Sunday nights before the Monday show. Missed you last week, Steve. I missed you a lot.
Yeah, we kind of kicked it down the line because we were waiting for the results of the primary. We were waiting for the vice presidential pick. And by the time we got around to it, it was like, well, we might as well just wait until the weekend.
Yeah. I feel good about that because there is actually a lot we can talk about. But before we get into that, Steve, I understand you did your civic duty. You helped America. You worked the polls.
Yes, I defended democracy. Well, this is an interesting thing. I live in Superior Township, which is just outside of Ann Arbor, sort of sandwiched between Ann Arbor and Canton, basically, on the eastern edge of Washtenaw County. And they were looking for poll workers. And I've been toying with the idea of a story that I haven't quite got my head around yet related to poll working. And I thought it'd be interesting. But it turns out for the presidential primary election, I actually took the Republican ballot because Joe Biden was on the Democratic ballot and he didn't really have any competition. And it turned out it wouldn't have made any difference. But I took the Republican ballot and I just thought it would be, worth doing. And then it turned out that's like the ticket because they need people who can credibly say that they are either an independent or a Republican. Because they got plenty of Democrats around here who will do the work as a poll, but they really need quote unquote Republicans. And so that was me. I was one of the two Republicans. It didn't really matter. And I mean, that's the thing about working polls is that it shouldn't matter. I mean, the party that the people who are checking your license and explaining the ballot and making sure that the documents are correct, the party of those people, really, I mean, I don't see what it has to do with anything other than that there is a sense that it's fairer to have people who have avowed themselves of each party. Honestly, it didn't matter. One of the things I thought was interesting was you made a comment about it just now. This idea that we're serving democracy. Okay, sort of, but I don't think people realize that poll workers are paid. I mean, I guess people do, but I can't tell you how many people were expressing gratitude to us for quote unquote volunteering. Like I wasn't really sure that they understood that this was a gig. It was, in our case, I think a $16 an hour gig. And on election day, I did not realize that the poll workers, pretty much all poll workers at every poll, work the entire shift. And the entire shift starts at about 6 a.m., an hour before the polls open. And it goes at least until about 9, which is about an hour after the polls close, but it can go longer. In our case, we had a faulty modem, and we had to redo a couple of reboots in order to get the votes out of the machine to the county. So it took a little while longer. We didn't have any unreconciled ballots. It was actually a really, really interesting process of how a ballot gets spoiled and then how people get reissued. I was working the electronic poll book. The electronic poll book was basically the computer and checking people in. And it was really fun to be in my own precinct, the precinct that I would normally be voting in on election day. Because I was working the polls, they actually asked us to vote early so that we wouldn't be voting at our polling places while we were also working there. It was interesting. And I heard, they're keeping in mind, because I think this might be the story for me, is that, first of all, Wayne County pays a lot better, I'm told. You are an election worker in Detroit, you get paid better than you would in Washtenaw, which is probably the only case where that's probably true about anything in between these two counties. But also, I know for a fact that, having people who are independent or can credibly claim to be Republican is an in. It's a way to get into this gig because they really need them in these areas. I'm sure in the UP and other parts of the state, it's the opposite. If you can say that you're a Democrat, you probably get the job. because they probably have a hard time finding enough Democrats to balance it out. It was very interesting. It was very interesting to see, my neighbors. It was interesting to observe how painstaking and careful the election process is. And there were probably more spoiled ballots where the voter voted incorrectly. The tabulator spit it out and said, this isn't going to be acceptable, or people realized that they had spoiled their ballots. And they can just come back and get another one, but there are a couple of steps to it. But what was interesting about it was that it was almost entirely because it was a primary election. And the way that people were spoiling their ballots was by picking Democratic candidates for one thing, Republican candidates for another. And you can't do that during a primary election. You have to pick a party and only vote in that party. And if you try to mix and match, it's spoiled and the machine can't handle it. And that was kind of interesting. And also people who would show up and then the computer would show us that they had received absentee ballots. And if they received the absentee ballots and there was no indication that they had returned it, then they had to sign the affidavit saying that they had lost it. We had to go over to the clerk's office and make sure that as of that day, election day, they had not received the person's absentee ballot in the mail. And then we could give them a ballot. And it was a longer process. And technically, I guess we were supposed to tell them to go home and get it if they didn't have it with them, but they didn't say it was lost or damaged. But it was pouring.
Yeah.
All day. And it wasn't my decision. But for the most part, we just accepted people's claim that they didn't have it and then that they weren't going to or they hadn't returned it. There was not one case in which any voter showed up on election day and the computer said that their absentee ballot had been received or that they had voted early. So there was no indication of that. And in the end, it looked like about 1/3 of the people who voted this primary election showed up in person on election day, which means that 2/3 voted early or voted absentee. And I thought that was an interesting data point because that means that most people in non-pandemic times are not going to show up on election day. The actual election starts the day that ballots are available to be turned in.
For sure. And I would assume also a shift in how you spend on media. I was driving around Oakland County and it was saturated with Kamala billboards, but there were billboards for people who used to vote for Trump and now are going to vote Harris. And I was like, wow, there's going to be just so much advertising bombed and it's going to start now because you're absolutely right. If 2/3 of voters, in your case, but I feel like that's going to carry across in a lot of areas, people are going to be making their decisions early. So those ads need to go out a lot earlier too. It's not just the race to election day.
Well, one thing that's interesting to me is I mentioned this before, that when I lived in Nevada and covered Las Vegas and our county politics, we had early voting as far back as the late 90s. And I used to be fascinated by the fact that the way that people voted early and the way they voted on election day were roughly the same. That there really wasn't a difference in the sample, in the way that it wasn't as though somebody who would have been ahead after early voting would lose on election day. It didn't happen very much. The percentages were very, very similar. But that all got scrambled probably longer ago than I think, but definitely with the effort by the Trump campaign in 2020 to stigmatize early voting and absentee balloting and make it seem like it was somehow fraudulent. And so it's less reliable in terms of being a sample because it is politicized too. And Democrats are comfortable with it and a lot of Republicans are less comfortable with it. And so it's a little less representative.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about these campaigns because since we last talked, there have been some pretty big swings. A recent Sienna College poll shows Harris is making a ton of headway in swing states. In Michigan specifically, a 6-point swing up to 50% versus Trump's 46. Pennsylvania, she's at 50%. Wisconsin, she's at 50%. She's basically claimed back all of the Democratic Party norm. It's a whole different kind of vibe. And there was another poll that I saw that I cannot remember exactly where it was from, and so I apologize about that. But the campaign seems to be really re-energizing people. Is that Democrats' feelings about the election have moved from fear to hope. So like 30, so that 38% of Democrats said they were voting out of fear, 33% out of anger. This is before Biden dropped out. Now that with Harris in, it's 37% of Democrats are now voting due to hope, and anger went down to 19%. Basically, all of that shift went to hope. I mean, I feel like this is a whole new race on so many levels.
It is, but it's not necessarily, and this is why the numbers are so striking. It's not necessarily people who were going to vote for Trump who are now voting for Harris. I'm sure there are some of those people, but it's a lot of people who either weren't going to vote at all or were looking for some other alternative because they just didn't think that Joe Biden was up to the task, and that was the only other choice. The switch has been fascinating. I mean, this has been three of the most interesting weeks in American politics to see this race flip so dramatically. The only comparison I can make, and I'm not even sure it's a good one, is it's not a really good comparison, but Michael Dukakis came out of the 1988 Democratic Convention with like a 13-point lead. Like, he had a huge lead over George H.W. Bush at the time, and then it went away and he lost it. It's not the same thing, but it is head spinning to see how things are changing in this race. And yet it's not surprising when you really start thinking about it. I mean, I said this before on the show and other places. The public in general does not like Donald Trump. They simply don't like him. They don't trust him. They don't believe him. And they don't really want what he represents or what he's selling. But more specifically, they don't really want the experience that they had from 2017 to 2021 of seeing the president of the United States creating chaos and division and craziness every day. I mean, it was really exhausting. I don't know if you remember what it felt like when they shut him up on Twitter. It was like you could go outside again because the storm had stopped. It was so much more peaceful. And what you're seeing is the Donald Trump campaign is every day reminding everybody what that was like. And, I really do think, actually, that Joe Biden would have benefited from that, too. But Kamala Harris is just better at this. She's more ready to be the kind of rebuttal and voice that a lot of people have been wanting for a long time. So, she's the sitting vice president, and somehow she's the change candidate. Go figure.
I think in part this is because a lot of people have not been introduced to her. Like, they've heard the name, but I think there's a lot of defining left to do, both for her and, of course, Tim Walz, because I think even the most astute political observer would be like, I know he's a governor in Minnesota and is in Congress and, a couple other things, but he wasn't really on the radar until this campaign. And now all of a sudden he's America's dad.
Yeah, I was ultimately not surprised when she chose him because I had, I guess the reporting had been very good about how this was going and the way that Josh Shapiro was essentially undermining his own opportunity, not just because of some of his own baggage, but just because he and the vice president did not fit together very well. I think he thought he had a stronger hand than he did. He thought he could demand certain things out of the future president that she wasn't going to go for. And then there was this other guy who was incredibly good at this, incredibly good at, and again, giving the public something new to chew on. You've only got 3 months left. And, every day that they have that they can spend, giving the public something interesting and shiny to look at and play with, it's a win for the Democrats because the Republicans are the same old. This is the third election in a row that the Republican candidate is Donald Trump. There's nothing interesting there. There's nothing new.
I can't help but feel like Tim Walz is the kind of guy who came into this going, look, I'm going to be an enthusiastic vice president. And Shapiro, to me, gives me vibes that he just really wants the top job. And those are two different vibes. And you don't necessarily want that guy as your number two.
No, you really don't. Trump has him, but whatever. I mean, J.D. Vance clearly wants to be president. Mike Pence probably wanted to be president. I never really got that vibe out of Joe Biden when he was vice president for Obama. I didn't get the sense that he had his own sort of operation going on. It turned out that he did end up wanting to be president, and he got to do it, and off he goes now.
Yep, off he goes into the sunset wearing aviators. Do Republicans have an uphill march? Is it just back to status for them in Michigan? I feel like, the weaknesses that we saw in Metro Detroit are definitely gone with the new candidates as opposed to Biden.
You know how I feel about polling. You know that I think that polling is largely broken. And one of the reasons why it's so broken is because it doesn't reach young voters very well. It doesn't reach Democrats or working people very well. And so if the polling is showing that she's winning by 4 points, in my mind, she's winning by more. I always kind of just have this sense about that. It feels different now. It feels like we have a convention coming up and then some debates probably. We have all these sort of moments coming. And I just don't know how the Trump campaign reverses it because they have no control over their candidate. Their candidate has no control over himself. He says the craziest things. He retweets the craziest things all the time. It wouldn't even matter if he said something true because nobody would believe him. I think that she has so much runway. She has so much space to introduce herself and engage with people. She is a suburban mom in a lot of ways. She comes across that way. She comes across as somebody that you know. And so does Tim Walz, to the extent that a vice presidential candidate will matter one way or the other. I think the Democrats, it's now their race to lose.
Let's go down the ballot a little bit then and talk about Elissa Slotkin. Obviously beat Hill Harper. We spent a little bit of time on it earlier in the week. The focus, now is really on Mike Rogers. Me and Norris earlier in the week talked about the idea that Mike Rogers of old would have a better time against Elissa Slotkin in this race, but a MAGA Mike Rogers just doesn't have the same appeal as the older Mike Rogers. It's an interesting theory kind of put out there. What do you think?
I think he can probably thread the needle well enough. He probably can say enough things to appeal to the Republican base without entirely distancing himself from the rest of the public. But none of the issues line up for him. This is another election that's going to be largely about abortion and freedom that the Trump administration wants to take away. And this is a state that hasn't elected a Republican to the Senate in this century. So, I think that particularly with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket and the state's recent record of electing women for governor and attorney general and all kinds of jobs for a while now. And they're used to it. And it's worked out pretty well for the state, I think a lot of people would say. I think he won't humiliate himself. He won't go down the way a Bill Schuette went down or even a John James. I think it'll be a respectable race, partly because Elissa Slotkin has been working on the middle. So she's trying to get the same voters in a lot of ways. And we talked last time, I said I hadn't seen any Slotkin signs, and now I have seen them, and they conspicuously don't say anything about her party. It's just her name. That's all it is. Entirely. I mean, there is no organization. The organization for statewide races in the state is entirely up to the Trump campaign on the Republican side. They have to pull it all out, and that does again put Mike Rogers in on his heels. He has to be subservient to the Trump campaign. Otherwise, there is nobody else out there to volunteer for him, to knock doors for him, to make calls for him, to raise money for him. So he can't distance himself from the Trump people as well as he would like to. And more importantly, there isn't anybody to do the work for him, because that bunch is just a mess. Betsy DeVos can pour a bunch of money into some sort of parallel operation, but it's not the same. It's not the same as the party having a grip on its voters. It's a mess, and I don't see how he overcomes that.
Well, let's close out with a listener question. Anne asks, how much do you honestly think the situation in Israel and Gaza will impact the election? Not really what you think of the conflict itself, but how will it impact the presidential race? So I think this is an interesting one, because this isn't really about like what we think about what's going on the ground there, but how will what's going on there impact what's happening in the voting booth?
Well, I think it already has. I think that the protest about Gaza and everything that's been happening there is a significant reason Josh Shapiro is not on the ticket. And I know that Tim Walz has very similar quotes, or there's like a meme going around that lists a bunch of positions and makes you think you're talking about Josh Shapiro, and turns out you're talking about Tim Walz. Those can be taken out of context. Josh Shapiro was a much harder line pro-Israel figure, and it's not that he was Jewish, but that choosing him would be a thumb in the eye of important voting blocs, specifically young voters and Muslim voters and Arab voters. It didn't happen largely because Kamala Harris didn't feel comfortable with him, and that's the end of that. But it's already affected this race in that respect. It's also affected it in as much as if Joe Biden remained in the race, those folks were not going to vote. And that was a big problem. So she gets to reset to some extent, because she did say early on that she wanted a ceasefire before the president came along and said the same thing. I think that it's already affected the race. I don't know how much more it can affect the race, because, I mean, you can't stack these two people side by side, Harris and Trump, and not see that Trump would be ruthless and pretty much uninterested in the fate of people in Gaza.
I get the sense that the Trump side of things would just as soon turn Gaza into a resort. Just level it and move everybody out. You know what I mean? And just stick up some umbrellas and start selling packages.
Yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it that way, but like it's kind of like it's that kind of stark difference, although it's not as far as I know a lot of advocates want. I will note, too, that Kamala Harris, in the campaign speech, she had a little bit of a rough start here in Michigan with something she said around this, but then she kind of corrected herself a bit and talked again about a ceasefire, and in more forceful ways than somebody who occupies the actual presidency can, right? Because the president saying it is a different way than the vice president saying it. President Joe Biden was always kind of hand-tied with that in a lot of ways. And it is also wasn't his style to be that direct.
Well, also, yes, she is the sitting vice president, but really her job now is running for president. Her job is not vice president anymore. It's her title. But to the extent that there can be plausible space between what Joe Biden is trying to do and what Kamala Harris says, it might be a little bit awkward, but I think they've made peace with that idea that she may say things that he can't, and vice versa. Like the fact that Joe Biden was the one that came out with the proposals for reforming the Supreme Court, that gives her permission to talk about some of this, which would have been very different if she had been the one, the Democratic candidate for president, had been the one who first brought that up as an idea. Term limits for Supreme Court justices, ethics rules around what they can do. They're playing it pretty well. But I didn't know. That she stumbled. What did she say?
There was some protesters at the rally in Romulus, and she came out very aggressively with saying, I'm speaking, and not really addressing it directly. Then the next stop, when there were inevitably protesters again, it was much more of a empathetic read and then able to directly pivot and talk about what she wanted to do and what she's pushing for, which I think was far more accepted than the first time, because the first thing played really well in the room, but outside in the greater world, it did not play as well.
Oh, I think it played great. I mean, now that you're talking about it, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the part where she was being interrupted and she said, I'm speaking now. And here's why it played great. It played great because it brought in this other element, which is she gets to say that she is not to be disrespected. What I'm trying to say is, if it's some white guy, say Trump or even Biden or whatever, and they get kind of ruffled or annoyed that there's some sort of protesters who are interrupting their speech. Well, white guys have always been able to speak. And they've always had the floor. They've always been able to talk over the protesters, have them taken out, talk down to them. And she gets to turn around and say, hey, I'm a woman of color, and you will not shut me up. And I think it's really powerful, actually, because we've never seen a national figure like that who is comfortable enough to aggressively push back like that and own her microphone, who owns her platform. I mean, I think that Hillary did it a couple of times, but she did it in a way that felt much more defensive. And this was a Black woman standing up and saying to probably other people of color, but you couldn't see them, no, no, I'm speaking now. This is my turn. I actually thought that it was really effective. I liked it.
Yeah, and I got a lot of notes liking it. Then I got a lot of notes from people not liking it whatsoever, feeling that she was minimizing basically, their issue. And there are a lot of people who, with this issue, it's a minority, but it's a vocal minority who feel very strongly about this issue. And they feel like, protesting is the only way that they're going to get heard. Because in a lot of this shuffle, honestly, this conflict's shuffling to the back over all the domestic issues, which, by the way, and I do not mean to belittle it, but that's every election. Foreign issues always shuffle to the back. And I don't mean to dismiss it. It's just kind of is what it is. So I think a lot of protesters, they wanted to kind of push the issue again at the next stop, and then she directly addressed it. So I thought that was interesting.
If that is your most significant issue, then of course you're going to be annoyed by anybody who says that they don't want to hear you in any moment that you have. I mean, these people want to be upset. It helps them to be angry at everybody. But for most people who saw her tell the protesters to stop, I think that the way she did it was the way that, God, I think so many women in particular wish they had the presence of mind and the attitude to say. I think she really stood up for herself.
Well, Steve Freese, I'm going to leave it there. It's so good to talk to you. And of course, we will check in again next Monday. I really appreciate it, because if there's anything, this will not be boring. If people have got questions like Ann did, dailydetroit@gmail.com, send them along. If you want to leave a voice memo, record it on your phone, send it an email. I'll play it as long as it's, somewhat appropriate. And I really appreciate the feedback, and I appreciate you, Steve. This is going to be fun from now until Election Day.